previously. And I had never met Tom. Didn't know, I didn't was sure how to pronounce his last name. And I was like, why is this person just calling me? He's like, hey, I hear your people's coming up here. And he spent a long time saying, I know this isn't going to sound weird because you're both Jewish, but there's this guy, Elliott Berry, you need to know about. And it was totally awkward. And he really said that. He really made it clear that but for Elliott, probably none of us would be here, Rock wouldn't be here, that, you know, he's the person. And I heard Elliott, there was an event honoring Elliott on May 5th from all the lawyers in the state. So what I can assure you is in the next 45 minutes, you're going to hear Elliott talk about how everyone else but him gets credit for the 60-day notice, resident-owned communities, and you know how unimportant and irrelevant his own sort of work has been. So keep that in mind. But one of the reasons we're doing these conversations is we want to capture this for subsequent people to understand like how the heck did this happen with the 60-day notice and why, how this came. But we also have a lot of young people in the organization. And Elliott's managed to put together a successful life as a person as well as an important professional career. And you know, what are the lessons sort of learned by someone who managed to balance values and career, you know, in a way that's better than decent. So anyway, I hope we've embarrassed you sufficiently.
Totally. Can I turn my chair a little bit? So is that okay?
Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
as long as it just comes this way. Yeah, perfect.
Let me just start by saying that when I was asked to do this, I was told it was a staff meeting, and my headset about this is still a staff meeting, so I guess that means Julie and John Hamilton, and that's about it. It is the last thing in the world I expected was to see so many people here, and then to hear all the wonderful things that you're doing. I just never, ever dreamed that the institution that was started in the basement of Mount St. Mary's College in Hooksett would grow to be so vibrant, so creative, and so big. So, you know, it's a pleasure, and I hope I have something of some interest. Anyway.
Adele, where are you from?
Detroit.
How the heck did you get to New Hampshire? And I mean, how? You know, were your parents activist lawyers? Like, how?
I got here largely through the New York Thruway, I think. I went to law school in Boston and used to come up here for a weekend, you know, for a lot of the reasons probably that some of you all have come. It's a great place to recreate, and I learned quickly it was a great place to raise a family. Originally, the family I came from, my parents, it was a pretty typical household in most respects. In those days, my mom raised kids. My dad was, ironically, he was in real estate and in a company founded by my grandfather, who said to me one day, you know what, you're working against everything I tried to do. But he was a terrific philanthropist and a wonderful human being who, the classic story about coming over as an immigrant with $100 in his pocket and making a good life for himself and bringing his 7 brothers and sisters over here. So, I was raised in a family with really solid values, and I'm incredibly lucky to have been the beneficiary of their values.
Were you in Detroit before the population decline?
Yes, Detroit was still, when I was leaving to go to, in the summer of '67, to move to Boston, that very day we're driving down the expressway to go across the bridge to Canada, cut through that way, and that was the day that the riots broke out in Detroit. And that was the beginning of Detroit's downward spiral. Happily, the city, I think, is really starting to make a comeback, and housing is still relatively affordable, and I think that has something to do with why it's coming back, but it's exciting to see.
So, but I want to make it clear that we're not going to have a remote work policy for those of you that want to buy houses in Detroit and commute to Manchester, and well, so you can get here for the staff meetings, we're cool. Did you, I mean, just because of when you went to college, did you have experience or, with the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War, one on either pro or anti-Vietnam War protests?
Yeah.
Did those have, were you swept up in either of those movements?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time in demonstrations. I was not a leader of any kind, but a lot of my undergraduate career was speaking against the war, both in small groups and in obviously very large, massive demonstrations. I was never beaten up, I was never arrested. I kind of feel sheepish about that. But yeah, I mean, the University of Michigan was a hotbed of anti-war activity and radicalism in general. I believe that SDS, Students for Democratic Society, was founded in Ann Arbor, I believe.
Does ever, raise your hand if you don't know what SDS, if you've never heard of that organization. Can you, critical, but do you mind just talking about you don't have to do their manifesto. But,
yeah, so I wasn't the member, but I think it was one of the first identifiable groups that was really advocating for a democratic socialist revolution.
I've heard you in other scenarios talk about the women in your family. Did you have experience with the women's movement as well with that? Is there any connection, or did you just, were you just raised right?
It's a little hard to talk about, actually. I think my mother suffered greatly from not having a college degree, from having spent most of her energy raising kids. And I did not want to repeat that pattern. So I was married twice, and my first wife was a determined feminist. And my current wife, Campbell Harvey, made her look wimpy on the issue. Maybe I overreacted, I don't know. Yeah, women in my life, the most important women as an adult, have had a huge influence. As has working at New Hampshire Legal Assistance, which quite, predictably, among all the types of legal practice in the United States, is probably the most female friendly, or some would say female dominated, and that's been great.
I want to talk about that a little bit, but I want to hear, you come out of law school, how did you, was it a direct shot to New Hampshire Legal Aid, or did you take a circuitous path? How did you get there?
So I knew, believe it or not, when I went to law school, it was for the sole reason of being a legal aid lawyer, strangely. It's clearly one of the 2 or 3 best decisions I ever made. It just happened to link up perfectly with my quirky personality. So I did interview at Florida Rural Legal Services, which was crazy because I hate the heat. And my then wife said, if you go down there, I'm not going with you. So then I interviewed at Pine Tree Legal Services up in Prescott, which was hardly an improvement. And then so I ended up getting an offer to be a VISTA attorney, volunteer in service to America, where I got paid about almost $4,000 a year. I did that for a couple of years, and it really stuck.
How does for people that don't know, how does legal aid get funded? Since their clients tend to be people of low incomes, they it's not like going to a Main Street law firm where they charge $400 an hour. And how does your organization, New Hampshire Legal Aid, get its money?
Yeah, when I first started, our major funding was from the Office of Economic Opportunity, which doesn't exist anymore, but Congress funded that into the Legal Services Act. And those were great days because we didn't have to keep time records. It was all essentially one grant with minor United Way stuff like that. So, but then and I'm good, let me apologize for this right now. When I look back, I have a very hard time figuring out what happened when. But at some point, I'm going to guess the late 80s, Congress put some severe restrictions on what legal services corporate or offices could do. We couldn't do lobbying, we couldn't do class action lawsuits. And so our then director, Bob Gross, made a very courageous decision to let go of that money. And it was the only time in my career where we had big layoffs. And at one time, I think there were as few as 11 attorneys statewide immediately after that, which was a horrible thing to go through. You have one thing about working in legal services, like working here, is that you share so much in common with so many of your colleagues, and to see them go through what they did was horrendous. But anyway, now we have, thank God I've never been involved in this process in a significant way, but now we have so many different grants, and it's really difficult. But our two biggest sources of funding are from the state. We get a state appropriation, and then we get money from the New Hampshire Bar Foundation, and that comes from the interest on lawyer trust accounts. Although in these many past years where there's been almost no interest, I'm not sure how to stay afloat. We get a significant grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to do housing discrimination work. And a lot of money now is flowing for advocacy around domestic and sexual violence. So,
And it's funny, that was before we talked to what you're really known for, I wanted to ask you about that. Because I think it's something that isn't talked about with domestic violence. Like, how does legal aid come to serve people that may be experiencing, and I'm really trying to, the leading question, the economic impact, like how expensive it is to be a victim of domestic violence.
I mean, we could go on and on about that. Let me just start. The way we got involved initially is that we would represent women who had experienced violence, and we would go to court with them to get restraining orders. In those early days, we had to go to Superior Court, which was incredibly inconvenient for some. There's only 10 superior, one for each county in the state. So just the logistics of that were really difficult. My wife, who wasn't my wife then, drafted the legislation that enabled, it's RSA 173B, that enabled people to go to their local district court, fill out pre-printed forms, check boxes, fill in blanks, and they can get them on their own. But we continue now. It's so multifaceted, but she did police training, a lot of it judge training. There's so much more sensitivity to the issue. Unfortunately, the violence continues, and I'll leave it to someone a lot smarter than I am to try to figure out how to make it stop. But the economic impacts, you can imagine so many times, when a restraining order issues, the perpetrator is kicked out of the home. The perpetrator often was, many times, is the primary wage earner. There are child care issues. There's just issues of just paying the rent. It goes on and on. Even with or without violence, family breakup for women has been an incredible economic challenge.
Todd, I don't know how to make a graceful segue, so I want to hear about how did you meet were you interested in housing first, or did you meet Julie first? Like how, I'd love to hear the origin story.
Yeah, so I started at Legal Aid in 1975. And I was in, I mean, I can't tell you why, but I was initially focused on housing. That was my major thing, not my only thing. And it just became clear really early that, you know, even after a couple of years of defending eviction after eviction, that there's got to be a better way. I've never figured out that better way, but, and so, and one of the things which was an eye-opener for me, when you grow up in Detroit, you don't have a lot of experience with manufactured housing parks, or what they used to call trailer parks in those days. But I got hooked up early with a group called the Mobile Homeowners and Tenants Association, and a wonderful couple, Al and Doris Levesque, who are no longer with us. But they had done really good work with my predecessor and later boss, Bob Gross, in passing the initial RSA 205A, the Mobile Homeowners Bill of Rights. And so, as Bob became director, I was the one to work with Al and Doris, and it became obvious that there was a lot more work that could be done in the legislature to protect tenants. The great contribution of that initial legislation was that mobile home owners who rented spaces in parks could not be evicted unless they, committed significant violations of park rules, didn't pay the rent. But they basically couldn't be evicted unless they had done something that they shouldn't do or failed to do something that they should do. It made it, it was a really important contribution, but one of the things that still needed to be done is that one of the grounds for eviction that was not related to tenant fault or homeowner fault was the sale or the closing of a park, actually it was the closing of a park. And there was nothing about what could happen when a park was sold. So that was becoming a real problem as land in New Hampshire was starting. I don't know, again, this is, you all are probably way too young to remember this, but starting in the late 70s, southern New Hampshire in particular began to be one of the fastest growing states east of the Mississippi, although southern New Hampshire isn't a state, I guess. But anyway, so land values began going way up, and there was all sorts of incentives for park owners to sell their land at a higher price, which meant new mortgages, new opportunities for the owners to raise rents, and that was becoming a big, big problem. So that's how I got into it.
How did you meet, how did you get in contact with Julie and the Community Loan Fund?
Yeah, so I knew you were going to ask me that question. Probably because of my connections with Motive. I was invited to
Could you just say what, Kelly, can you say what MOTA is?
Manufactured Owner and Tenant Association.
At that time, it was the Mobile Homeowners and Tenants Association, right? And so I got invited to a meeting at Mount St. Mary's, which used to be Mount St. Mary's College, in that kind of Gothic-looking building on Route 3 in Hooksett. And the only people I can remember who were there, and there were more, was Mike Swack, who I think you all know, just a wonderful guy, who was, my guess is that he was the convener of the meeting, because Michael had prior involvement with the Institute for Community Economics in Massachusetts, which was kind of at least in New England, the instigator for the land trust movement. And so Michael convened a group of people. Martha Bauman was there. God, I wish I could remember who else was there. But anyway, we decided pretty quickly that, oh, I know, sorry. Somebody must have approached Michael from the Sisters of Mercy, who actually were also around the table, who had somehow found out that there was a small park in Meriden where the owner wanted to sell to the residents. No one in the state had any experience doing anything like this. So the Sisters of Mercy put up the seed money, but also became the focal point around the table of trying to put together an entity who could make this happen on a recurring basis. And that's how the loan fund was started. And I think we operated, I would guess for around a year with no employees. Just people, the idea of coming together and giving away other people's money really appealed to me a great deal. And then the smartest decision we ever made was to hire, we finally got enough funds to hire Julie Eves, who, was a wizard. And probably is the person who's most responsible, far and away, for creating the institution that you all have become.
Tell me about the origins of the 60-day notice. And because we have a couple interns here who, well, actually, Alec has a week here, so maybe we should put him on the spot. But maybe you can just talk about what the 60-day notice is and how it all came about.
So this was the real connection between my work and the loan fund, is I got a resident of what was then called the Town and Country Mobile Home Park in Milford. A woman named Florence Quast, just a wonderful, wonderful woman who, between you and me, was not financially eligible for legal services, but when I heard what was going on, I said, what the hell? And, they had gotten a notice under what was then the law, that was 90 days, if a park was going to close, you give the homeowners 90 days notice, and then they could be evicted, and they would be evicted. Which was, you had 55 homes in this park, and the purchaser of the park was going to turn it into a stick-built condominium. And it would be as if, it struck me exactly like if a tornado had ripped through the park and destroyed the entire community. It's exactly the same result. And so I'll never forget this. I forget a lot of things these days, but not this. There was a meeting at a local church, and it seemed like all of the 55 residents homes were represented at the park, and it was total panic. And I'm standing on the pulpit and I said, don't worry, we are not going to let this happen. And I'm driving home from Milford. I live in Manchester. What on earth did you say? Why did you say that? I had no idea how this was not going to happen. Fortunately, we were able to delay things long enough, and there was a really, the town manager was a guy named Lee Mayhew, who was quite sympathetic, which I can't say the whole town of Milford felt that way, but he was great, and he decided that, or we convinced him to apply for a community development block grant to enable the major source of funding to purchase that park. And the one thing I learned early in my career is you should never let a disaster go to waste. So we used that story. The park didn't close, they purchased it, and one of the happiest moments of my career was the opening of that, the opening party of the cooperative that was legislature, and ended up, we first wrote it as a right of first refusal. It ended up now, as you all know, or most of you know, the park owner has to give each resident a notice telling them that he's intending to sell the park and to the price and other essential terms of the agreement, and notify them of the opportunity to organize and negotiate for the purchase of the park. And somehow, because of that story, we were able to pass that legislation. The rest is history.
I'd love to hear more about, the way you're making it sound so simple. But let's be clear. Radical civil rights lawyer, Jewish, working with people, trying to represent people living in manufactured housing, and you're walking into the general court of New Hampshire and trying to be successful. I'm imagining you probably needed to go with other people.
Sure, and
how did you build the campaign, and how did you get through the legislature?
Yeah, the substance of our legislation was so compelling, not just in theory, about the common ownership of land, but all of them could relate to the story, what happened in Milford. And so turnout was really not a problem. The other thing is that I'd forgotten about this. If you talk about, a radical lawyer from Detroit, I started an effort in Allenstown to pass a rent control ordinance for manufactured housing parks. And we picked Allenstown because there was a slight majority of manufactured housing park owners in the town. So I figured, we'll put something on, get a warrant article in town meeting, and we passed it by a hair. The town refused to enforce it, and you should have seen, at one point we had a hearing where Representative Hall, for 400 legislators, it was packed. And one of the lawyers for in opposition, for the park owners, publicly called me a communist, which I didn't really care about. But anyway, but knowing that route wasn't going to go, right? This wasn't going to go anywhere. This became a better solution, quite frankly, of this being resident ownership. But we were able to build on a very broad coalition that I give all the credit in the world to Moda. So that part was easy. I also was able to build on carefully nourished credibility from my predecessor, who had Gross, who had worked so hard and well on the initial mobile home owners Bill of Rights. And so it wasn't nearly as hard as you think. And again, with a lot of people behind, a lot of affected constituents, and the citizens legislature, that's the other thing, is that, and Tara probably he remembers this very well, the world of that legislature, while conservative, was nothing like it is today. Politics has so changed for the worse. As a matter of fact, a lot of the important legislation that I did in those days for tenants generally, the prime sponsors were Republicans. They were people who cared, and if you had a compelling issue, you could make it work. And that's what's so heartbreaking about today, quite frankly, at every level of American government, but in politics. But anyway, it wasn't as hard as you think. The hard part was there was a lot of hard negotiation with the park owners' lawyers, and they didn't make anything easy. And especially when we got to remedies. The initial remedy was, it was, I think, $10,000. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but for a violation. And it wouldn't, you couldn't go to court to stop the sale based mean, these were big problems, and there were owners who came along later and just said, what the heck, I'll violate it, pay my $10,000, it's nothing compared to the profit I was gonna make. So, you know, it was a give and take, and I don't mean to say it was easy, but the basic premise made so much sense. You know, and in some ways a basic, you know, it wasn't a radical idea. Well, I don't know, maybe it was. But in retrospect, it just didn't seem as hard as you think it would have been.
I promise I'm going to give you all a chance to ask, you know, Elliott some questions, but I got a couple more for you. Why 60 days? Because I got to tell you, a lot of times I come to work and go, Elliott, why not 90? Come on, man, or 120.
Yeah, that was one of the issues, right? It was 60 days because that's the best we could get. And if you open any book of New Hampshire statutes, 95% of the time that's going to be the answer, is that it's a really imperfect process. You don't get everything you wanted. Oh, the other thing I started with 5 years notice. You're laughing. Think about, I mean, this was my cell. It obviously didn't work. But you have 56 homeowners who have to leave.
Right.
At the time, there weren't 56 empty spaces in existing parks. And, you know, hardly anyone could purchase their own lot to put it on. And if they could, the zoning wouldn't allow it anyway. So I didn't think it was unreasonable, but a lot of, anyway, so that got pared down to 18 months. But
So looking at the two questions I want to ask you, the first one is, and you know the second one I'm going to ask you, but the first one is, in the next 3 years, if you had to tell, you know, Tara's successors, you know, in the organization about the policy things we need to push for, what should be top of mind for us?
well, one thing that jumped into my head is that in St. Anselm's College, I think the Center for Business Ethics, a wonderful professor there named Max Latona has really gotten his teeth into zoning. And what they have been working with Housing Action New Hampshire. And what they did a very deep dive into zoning ordinances in every municipality in the state has adopted one. And one of the things they found is that the opportunity to put manufactured housing on small lots or to develop new parks is extremely limited. So one of the things that I would do is reach out to Housing Action New Hampshire, because Max's group has to be apolitical, and really start looking at legislation to increase, to mandate, quite frankly, that towns allow more realistic opportunities to develop manufactured housing parks. I think that's the only thing I can think of right now that's, there are small things, as you said, I would expand the notice period if I could. But you all have been doing a lot more creative thinking about this than I have. You know, the irony is, and you know, I feel a little weird about this, but most of my interface over the last probably decade and a half with co-ops has been defending people who are getting kicked out of small parks. And, you know, that is, anyway, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that's the best use of our time, but I hate to see people homeless and losing their most valuable asset, if not their only valuable asset. So I haven't been doing a lot of creative thinking about that, and I trust, you know, that Tara will continue, even in her status as a, you know, as a retired person, to keep thinking about what the next moves are. I also didn't mention Paul Bradley, and I hope that you know, that most of you or many of you know him. I mean, he has been a visionary in taking this movement to the next level nationally. And the other person I should mention, who again is not with us anymore, is Lois Paris, who became the leader of MODA after Elle and Doris passed. So, I mean, she worked tirelessly with Paul, and as you probably know, they've been all over the country explaining, the whys and the hows of, resident-owned communities. So, again, my piece of this has not been insignificant, but it's been magnificent to see so many wonderful people working so hard and so creatively to make a movement out of some work that I was involved in, but I count it as one of the great successes of my career, but more importantly than that, I count it as an absolute privilege to have had that as a small part of my career.
I wish we could conclude on that, but I've got more I want to ask you. It's one of the conversations Elliott and I had before is nationally the Community Loan Fund is recognized for this sort of pioneering home ownership work and rejecting the received wisdom that people in manufactured housing parks were incapable of owning their parks and running their democracies, or that manufactured housing had asset value like stick-built homes. But it's never been harder to buy a house in New Hampshire. God knows what it would have been like but for Elliott and all those people that made the 60-day notice. So if you were to tell us what to do, in addition to the tools we have in our toolbox, like what are the products or are there things that you say, God dang it, I need the Community Loan Fund to go after this, not instead of what it's doing, but in addition, what would you tell us to do to increase our impact?
At some point, somewhere, someone's got to be able to get a handle on on speculative purchase of land, right? I mean, there is no, just leaving this to the private market, and this goes beyond manufactured housing, right? This society in my lifetime has never, ever produced enough housing that lower income people can afford. It's never happened, and it sure as hell isn't going to happen as long as land is just another, another commodity. And somehow, the idea of a right to housing is key. Some way, one of the things that I also have tried with, it was an abysmal failure, but if you could have a short-term, or if you can increase the taxation on the sale, on the purchase and sale of land, I don't know.
Like capital gains,
Yeah.
speculation.
Right.
Could you just, like in 15 or 30 seconds, tell folks what a land trust is? And are there ways in which, why hasn't a land trust model been successful, and could it be successful to answer some of the questions that you're raising?
There's actually a group in Manchester that's giving it a shot. The basic idea is that, as it was introduced to me into the group that created the loan fund by Chuck Mathai of the Institute for Community Economics. Again, he was the New England guru, if not national. But it was a fairly simple idea, which is that a nonprofit corporation would essentially own the land on which housing was situated or built, and then they would have long-term leases to cooperatives, was the basic model. I think, and you would control, obviously, you would control the resale of that of the housing through the land lease. Interestingly enough, in both Israel and in China, the state owns all the land, and that you work through, long-term leases is what makes it all work. And therefore, you know, you take the profit motive out of housing. It's an interesting idea. I think the problem is that why it hasn't been successful is that the idea of creating wealth through the ownership of housing is so deeply ingrained that even the consumer, right, the tenant, the person who would be in the housing built, you know, on the leased land, even for them, the idea of buying into a limited equity cooperative is so far has not been attractive enough. But given, you know, I think there is obviously a lot of you are members of a younger generation who's totally priced out of the market right now. And I think it is worth, I'm glad you brought it up, Steve, I think it is worth a second look, because now limited equity cooperatives with security of tenure is probably a lot more palatable than it used to be if the alternative is living with your parents.
Living with your parents, yeah. Two little historical footnotes. The first land trust in America happened because Charles Sherrod, who was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Georgia, and his wife Shirley Sherrod, organized a group of almost 50 people from Southwest Georgia to make a trip to Israel in 1967. And they came back after looking at kibbutzes, and in Southwest Georgia built an entirely black land trust. It was the first land trust in America in 1968, and they owned thousands of acres and were vertically integrated. But it was the failure, where Charlotte? It was the failure of the USDA to give them crop insurance in the 1970s that caused this land trust to fail, and it became the subject of a 25-year lawsuit about discrimination by the USDA towards black farmers. Glickman versus Pickford. Charlotte, who are the two people? Pickford versus US. Anyway, it was a landmark case. But the idea of collective land ownership, there was a progressive thinker by the name of Henry George. So in southern Alabama, he formed what was a utopian community called Fairhope, based on the single tax idea for everybody had this collective ownership. And Fairhope was the longest running utopian community in America. But going back to Elliott's point, it was the grandchildren who were golfers. And wanted to, and saw the value of the land on the water and at Fairhope, and there was declension, and Fairhope is still a town, but it's no longer this incredible utopian community. Don's giving me the eye that we only have 4 minutes left, so I want to open it up to questions with 4 minutes. If anybody wants to ask Elliott any questions about the future or the past while we have them here. Go ahead, Betsy.
Elliott, if you could see one piece of legislation pass at the State House to help right to housing, what would that be, like this year?
Well, I'll throw it back to Tara and Rick, or Chris rather. Since Steve mentioned it, in terms of resident-owned communities, I would certainly expand the notice period. But on a larger scale, I do think zoning remains a really big issue. But I would do something in zoning where it's not just to give municipalities the right to mandate that developments of any particular size include housing, what we're now calling workforce housing. And then more money. But I think this last budget actually does. We're still underfunding compared to workforce housing compared to our New England neighbors, but it's improving a lot. And at the end of the day, you need money and you need the willingness of communities to take it, to take the housing. If you don't have both, you're not going to expand the housing fast enough. Let me throw in one plug for, and then this is probably beyond most of the work that you do, but the certain political party had a field day with discrediting public housing. But if you're talking about housing for very low-income people. And there's too many of those, both in the state and the nation. We have to have some kind of public housing program where people are guaranteed long-term tenure in housing where they don't have to pay more than 30% of their income, no matter how low their income is. If that doesn't happen, you know, the attack on public housing created homelessness as much as deinstitutionalization, which is the one they always point at. But those two things together, when I first started, New Hampshire didn't have a homeless problem that I was aware of. But lo and behold, when you stopped funding new public housing, guess what happens? It's not rocket science. And somehow, you know, states like Massachusetts do have, and New York do fund their own public housing. I'll be long dead and gone before that happens here, but somebody needs to speak up for that sector of the population, because they're going to be spending 50, 70, 80% of their housing, of their income for housing, you know, for way too long, and that's a ticket to the street. I don't know if that probably didn't answer your question, but.
That's good.
Ms. Miller, last question.
So, Elliott, did you ever serve on the board of the community law fund?
Oh, yeah.
If so, how long, and what would you say one of your biggest accomplishments were during your tenure?
I was president for a good while. I have no idea for how long. I have no idea when. I was on the initial board for, it seemed like forever. I'm a terrible board member. I hate raising money. I hate asking my wife for money. You know, so honestly, my greatest achievement was being part of the group that hired Julie. And then having the good sense to let her carry out her vision. That was a brilliant move on my part. But sorry, I can't take much credit for the work I did on the board.
Well, thank you, everyone. Join me in thanking. You're welcome to stay with us for the rest of the staff meeting and more cupcakes.
Thank you.